You probably think of Samsung, Hyundai, and LG as brilliant South Korean companies that conquered the world through pure innovation and hard work. You might have seen K-dramas about the glamorous, all-powerful families who run these corporate empires, known as the Chaebol. That's the story most people believe, but here's what actually happens behind the scenes. These companies didn't just win in the free market. They were chosen by an authoritarian military government and force-fed state-controlled money to become national champions. Their incredible power isn't maintained through majority ownership, but through a deliberately confusing web of secret cross-shareholdings that allows a single family to control dozens of companies, with a tiny personal stake. This isn't conspiracy theory or speculation. This is how the system has been designed to work for over 60 years. And most people never learn about it because the success of these global brands hides the corrupt machinery that built them. This is the story of the Chaebol, how they actually operate in practice, and why understanding this changes everything you thought you knew about South Korea's economic miracle. This is the lore of money. We explore how money shapes history, power, and society. Subscribe for more. Before we expose how the Chaebol system actually works, you need to understand the official story they tell you. The official story is the miracle on the Han River, the tale of a nation rising from the ashes of the Korean War to become a global economic powerhouse in a single generation, all thanks to the hard work and ingenuity of its people and its great companies. Sounds reasonable, right? A classic story of national triumph. But here's what they don't tell you. The miracle wasn't a product of free market capitalism. It was a product of guided capitalism, a state-run project where the government handpicked corporate winners, drowned them in cheap loans, protected them from all competition, and ordered them to build the country's economy. This trick is ancient. Let's trace how it began. To understand the Chaebol, you have to understand the world they were born into. The aftermath of the Korean War in 1953, South Korea was one of the poorest countries on earth. Its economy was destroyed. It was dependent on foreign aid, and its per capita income was less than that of many sub-Saharan African nations. Then in 1961, a military general named Park Chung Hee seized power in a coup. He was an authoritarian ruler with a single overriding obsession: to build South Korea into an industrial powerhouse, strong enough to defend itself and rich enough to stand on its own feet. Park's strategy was called guided capitalism, and it was ruthless and effective. He immediately nationalized all of the country's banks, giving the state complete control over the flow of money. This was the master key. With control of the banks, the government could direct every dollar of investment towards its national goals. Park's government then created a series of 5-year economic development plans, targeting specific industries for growth. First light manufacturing like textiles, then heavy industry like steel and shipbuilding, and finally high-tech sectors like electronics. But the government couldn't build these industries itself. It needed corporate partners. So the Park regime selected a handful of promising companies to become national champions. These were the first Chaebol. The deal was simple and brutal. The government would shower these chosen companies with every advantage imaginable. They received preferential loans from state-owned banks at incredibly low interest rates. They got government guarantees for massive foreign loans. They were given tax breaks, subsidies, and most importantly, they were protected from any foreign competition through high tariffs and import bans. In return, the Chaebol had one job: deliver on the government's economic targets. They had to build the factories, hire the workers, and export the goods. The relationship was symbiotic, but the state was firmly in control. President Park was known to summon Chaebol founders to his office, threatening them and manipulating them to align with his national vision. He could take a successful business away from one company and give it to another if it served the state's interest. This was not a partnership of equals. It was a command economy run through private companies. The system worked spectacularly. For 3 decades, South Korea's economy grew at nearly 10% per year, one of the fastest rates in human history. But this process created a deep dependency. The Chaebol grew into giants, but they were giants built on a foundation of state support and protection, not pure market competition. This history is the secret to their power and their problems. The very mechanism that created the miracle also sowed the seeds of corruption, inequality, and systemic risk that plague South Korea to this day. So how does the Chaebol system actually work now, decades after it was first created? The core mechanism is the preservation of absolute dynastic family control over a sprawling corporate empire, even when the family itself owns a very small fraction of the company. It's a magic trick of corporate finance, and it relies on three key pillars: the founding family, a spider's web of cross-shareholdings, and aggressive diversification. At the top of every Chaebol is a single family, usually the descendants of the original founder. The Korean word Chaebol itself means wealth clan, which tells you everything you need to know about its structure. The family chairman, often called the emperor, wields absolute power, with his children and relatives placed in all the top executive positions across the group's many companies. This is not a meritocracy, it is a modern-day dynasty. The problem for these families is how to control a massive, publicly traded company like Samsung Electronics without actually owning 51% of its shares. The solution is the second pillar: a deliberately opaque and complex web of circular ownership, also known as cross-shareholding. Here's how it works in practice. Imagine the Samsung empire. The Lee family might directly own a controlling stake in just one key holding company. Let's call it Company A. Company A then owns a significant stake in Company B. Company B, in turn, owns a stake in Company C, which might be the crown jewel, Samsung Electronics. And to complete the circle, Company C might own shares back in Company A. By controlling the company at the top of this chain, the family can control the voting rights of all the companies below it. They are leveraging the shares owned by their own subsidiary companies to maintain control over the entire group. This structure allows them to exercise total command with a tiny personal investment. A study once found that the heads of the top 10 Chaebol could wield an average of 55% of the voting rights with a direct personal stake of less than 1%. Let that sink in. This system creates a massive conflict of interest. The family's goal is to maximize their personal power and wealth, which is often not the same as maximizing the value for all shareholders of a company like Samsung Electronics. This leads to practices like tunneling, where the family orders a publicly listed company to do business with a private company they own on unfair terms, effectively siphoning profits from public shareholders to their private pockets. It also explains why Chaebol companies are notorious for paying very low dividends. Distributing profits to all shareholders would dilute the family's control over that capital. This is the main reason for the famous Korea discount, where South Korean stocks trade at a lower value than their global peers. Investors know that the system is rigged in favor of the founding family, and they price that risk into the stock. The third pillar is extreme diversification. A single Chaebol like Hyundai operates in dozens of unrelated industries, from cars and steel to department stores and financial services. This strategy was originally pushed by the government to build up multiple sectors of the economy at once. Today, it serves to solidify the Chaebol's dominance over the entire national market. They are not just a big player in one industry, they are a big player in almost every industry, giving them unparalleled economic and political influence. This is the machinery behind the curtain: dynastic family control, multiplied by a financial trick of circular ownership, spread across the entire economy. So, who benefits from this incredibly complex and powerful system? The most obvious beneficiaries are the founding families themselves. This structure is designed first and foremost to preserve and amplify their wealth and dynastic control across generations. They live lives of unimaginable privilege, treated like royalty within South Korean society, and their personal fortunes are intertwined with the national economy. They command vast corporate empires, make decisions that affect millions of lives, and pass this power down to their children as a birthright. The second group that benefits is the political class. The symbiotic relationship forged under President Park Chung Hee has evolved into a deeply entrenched culture of collusion and corruption. Chaebols need political favors, deregulation, government contracts, and protection from prosecutors. Politicians need a constant flow of money to fund their campaigns and enrich themselves. This has created an unholy alliance where chaebols provide illegal bribes and kickbacks to politicians in exchange for favorable treatment. This isn't a rare occurrence, it is a structural feature of the system. The massive corruption scandal that led to the impeachment of President Park Chung Hee in 2017 was a textbook example. She was found to have colluded with a confidant to extort tens of millions of dollars from chaebols, including Samsung, in exchange for political favors. The constant cycle of scandals reveals a system where success is often determined not by innovation, but by political connections. Finally, a small elite segment of the workforce also benefits. The chaebol represent the absolute pinnacle of career aspiration in South Korea. The roughly 10% of workers who manage to secure a full-time, regular position at a company like Samsung or Hyundai enter a world of high salaries, excellent benefits, job security, and social prestige. These are the golden tickets of the Korean economy. Getting one of these jobs is seen as winning the lottery of life, providing stability for an entire family. This small elite forms a protected class, insulated from the harsh realities faced by the rest of the workforce. Their prosperity, however, comes at a very high cost to everyone else. While the families, politicians, and a small sliver of elite workers benefit, it is the rest of South Korean society that pays the price for the chaebol system. The most direct victims are the country's small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs. The chaebol's total market dominance creates a suffocating environment for smaller businesses. They act as monopolists, a single dominant buyer. A company like Hyundai Kia controls around 80% of the domestic car market, giving it immense power over its thousands of smaller parts suppliers. This power imbalance leads to predatory practices. Chaebols are notorious for price squeezing, using their leverage to force suppliers to sell parts at impossibly low prices, crushing their profit margins. Worse, they are frequently accused of technology theft, where a chaebol will demand a small supplier reveal its innovative technology as a condition of doing business, only to copy it and produce it themselves without compensation. This systematic exploitation hollows out the SME sector, which employs nearly 90% of the country's workforce. Trapped in a cycle of dependency, these smaller firms have no money or incentive to invest in their own research and development. They are forced to compete on price alone, becoming little more than low-cost workshops for the giants. This prevents the emergence of a vibrant, innovative SME sector like the one that powers Germany's economy. It creates a feedback loop that ultimately harms even the chaebols, making them masters of imitation and cost-cutting, but not necessarily of groundbreaking invention. The second group that pays are ordinary people, especially the youth, through the creation of a brutal dual labor market. South Korean society is now starkly divided into two tiers: the 10% inside the chaebol world and the 90% outside of it. The gap is enormous. A worker at an SME earns, on average, only about half of what their counterpart at a chaebol earns. A temporary worker at an SME makes just 35%. This has turned life into a zero-sum competition for the few good jobs. It fuels an insane education arms race, where families spend fortunes on private tutoring from a young age to get their children into one of the top 3 Sky universities, seen as the only pipeline into a chaebol. The stress and pressure on young people are immense. This system has destroyed social mobility. The odds of moving from a job at an SME to a large corporation are less than 3%. Your career path is essentially locked in from the start, creating deep-seated resentment and disillusionment. This is a primary driver of South Korea's demographic crisis, as young people facing such a precarious future simply cannot afford to get married and have children. The system that once built a nation is now fracturing its society. So why does this system continue despite causing so much damage? There are 3 powerful forces that lock it in place. The first and most important is the too big to fail dilemma. The chaebol are so enormous and so central to the economy that the failure of any one of them would trigger a national economic catastrophe. This reality was seared into the nation's memory during the 1997 Asian financial crisis. For decades, the Chaebols had engaged in reckless, debt-fueled expansion, confident that the government would always bail them out. When the crisis hit, their debts became unsustainable, and 11 of the top 30 Chaebol collapsed. The bankruptcy of the Daewoo Group, with $80 billion in debt, was the largest in world history at the time. The entire country was forced to accept a humiliating bailout from the International Monetary Fund. But the crisis had a perverse effect. While it wiped out the weakest Chaebol, the survivors like Hyundai were able to buy up their bankrupt rivals, like Kia Motors, at bargain prices. The market became even more concentrated, and the remaining Chaebol became even bigger and more essential. The too-big-to-fail problem was not solved. It was reinforced. Today, the government remains a hostage. Any serious attempt at radical reform is met with the threat that it will harm global competitiveness and crash the economy. This gives the Chaebol a permanent veto over any policy they don't like. The second reason it continues is the culture of elite impunity. Even when Chaebol chairmen are caught red-handed and convicted of serious crimes like bribery, embezzlement, and tax evasion, they almost never serve their full sentences. They are routinely given lenient sentences or presidential pardons, with the government arguing that their leadership is too vital to the economy to keep them in jail. Samsung's de facto leader, Lee Jae-yong, was pardoned after being convicted in the presidential impeachment scandal. This creates a powerful and corrosive public perception that there are two systems of justice, one for the super-rich Chaebol families and one for everyone else. It destroys public trust in the rule of law. Finally, the system is propped up by a deep cultural ambivalence. South Koreans have a love-hate relationship with the Chaebol. They resent their power, their corruption, and the inequality they create. But at the same time, they are a source of immense national pride. Brands like Samsung and Hyundai represent South Korea's success on the world stage. And despite all the criticism, getting a job at a Chaebol remains the ultimate life goal for millions of young people. This contradiction is everywhere in the culture, from the news headlines to the K-dramas obsessed with Chaebol family sagas. This split consciousness makes it incredibly difficult to build a unified political movement for fundamental change. People resent the game, but they still want to win it. The real-world consequences of this system are not abstract. They appear in explosive, recurring scandals that shake the nation to its core. The 1997 Asian financial crisis was the first major reckoning. It wasn't just a market downturn, it was a direct result of the Chaebol model. The investigation into the collapse of giants like Daewoo revealed a horrifying reality of fraudulent accounting to hide mountains of debt, and management decisions driven by the founder's ego rather than by sound business sense. The country learned a brutal lesson. When a system allows a few families to gamble with the national economy, eventually the bill comes due for everyone. The bailout was a moment of national humiliation, forcing deep introspection about the Chaebol problem. But the lesson wasn't fully learned. Fast forward to 2016, and the system produced an even more shocking political crisis: the impeachment of a sitting president. The scandal centered on President Park Chung Hee and her secret advisor, Choi Soon-sil. Prosecutors revealed that they had systematically extorted tens of millions of dollars from the country's biggest Chaebols. The case of Samsung was the most damning. Evidence showed that Samsung had given millions to Choi in exchange for the government's approval of a controversial merger of two Samsung affiliates. This merger was crucial for the founding Lee family because it would solidify the transfer of power from the ailing chairman, Lee Kun-hee, to his son, Lee Jae-yong, cementing the dynasty for another generation. It was a perfect example of the entire mechanism at work: the founding family's private interest in preserving dynastic control, the use of corporate resources to bribe the highest levels of government, and a political system willing to trade state power for cash. The scandal triggered massive public protests, with millions of Koreans taking to the streets, and ultimately led to the impeachment and imprisonment of the president. Samsung's leader, Lee Jae-yong, was also convicted and sent to prison in a landmark moment that seemed to promise real change. However, True to form, he was released early and eventually received a presidential pardon, demonstrating once again the incredible resilience of elite impunity. These are not isolated incidents. They are the predictable output of a system designed for collusion. So that's how the Chaebol system actually works. Not the story of a free market miracle, but the reality of a state capitalist machine designed to concentrate wealth and power into the hands of a few chosen families. It is a system that uses a complex financial trick, circular shareholding, to turn a tiny family stake into absolute control over a vast economic empire. This isn't new. You can see echoes of this model in the pre-war Japanese zaibatsu or the politically connected oligarchs in other nations. Different names, different technology, same mechanism of merging state and corporate power for the benefit of a tiny elite. The system depends on most people not understanding this. Financial education is resistance. Economic history is a weapon. When you know the trick, you're harder to manipulate. So what should you do? Understanding this system helps you see why South Korea faces such deep social and economic challenges, from youth unemployment to political corruption. It shows that these are not separate problems, but symptoms of a single underlying structural flaw. It also reveals that the glamorous global brands we use every day can have a much darker story behind them. The lesson isn't paranoia, it's awareness. The next time you see a story about South Korea's amazing economic performance, you will now understand the hidden social cost and the rigged game that produces those numbers. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.